Is it time for the United States to get back on the offensive when it comes to fighting terrorism? Well, from the Arab Spring to global warming to cybersecurity, and then you can throw in emerging technologies, we are going one-on-one with the intrepid globetrotter who heads WKU's Department of Geography and Geology, Dr. David Keeling. And later in the show, we're going to find out why study in this global arena is becoming more and more an asset to higher education. That's later in the program. Outlook is next. Hello and welcome to Outlook. 30,000 miles and 3 weeks with about a handful of countries scattered in there. We are talking with Dr. David Keeling, who we had to remind where he was. No, we were joking. The fact that you may have to look at your passport to figure out where you are. But you have just returned from a mission of sorts, if you will, an educational mission through the American Geographical Society, their educational travel program. 30,000 miles. You've been to Egypt, you've been across Asia, North America. So let's talk a little bit about, first of all, why is that so important?
It's critical, Barbara, because in the 21st century of a globalized society, we need to really understand more about political states and resources and climate variability and the plans and policies that other societies are making vis-a-vis their relationships in their own regions and their relationships with the United States. And as we now live in a multipolar world where not one country dominates the entire global system, it's incumbent upon U.S. citizens and policymakers to understand more about peoples and places around the world. That's the goal of these expeditions, to take people from the United States, business people, etc., to really understand some of these issues.
Well, let's take a look, and you brought along some show and tell, if you will, but there is a map, and we can take a look at some of the places that you traveled along the way. Help us out here.
So we started off in London. First port of call was Egypt, where we really tried to understand the implications of the Arab Spring and all of the policy implications for the U.S. and the region. We went to Rwanda, which is well known to Americans for the genocide that happened in 1994. And there we looked particularly at resource management, but also the role of training women in that economy to become better educated and more entrepreneurial. Only 3% of Rwanda women actually get an education. So, that's an important part of restructuring an economy. Other places like South Africa, the Maldives, have to deal with the implications of climate change. The Maldives averages about 3 feet in elevation. If sea level rises by 4 feet, you can do the math. Mm-hmm. This is not good for the Maldivians. In places like Thailand, Bhutan, India, we looked at resource management, regional geopolitics, and then we ended up in Jordan, where we looked again at this whole process of political and social change in the Arab world, in a country that's fairly moderate.
Well, let's back up, okay? First up, Egypt. Cairo. So we are just a year out of the Arab Spring. So for our viewers who may not understand, they've probably heard reference to the Arab Spring, but what are we talking about?
This is the wave of bottom-up revolutionary change that began last January, February in Tunisia, rolled through Egypt, Libya, and into now we're dealing with the Syrian outcomes. But this is a force from below where the majority of these populations are impoverished, disenfranchised. Many of the educated middle class can't get jobs because of the political structure of these societies. And so this whole Arab Spring is really a revolutionary movement from below. But it's interesting to note that in the United States, we have a very naive and romantic view of revolutionary change in the Middle East, as though democracy is going to break out all of a sudden and they'll embrace the American democratic economic ideals. That's just not happening.
Well, and you've brought photographs of that as well. And I think one of the first photographs that we're going to see is of a street in Egypt, a blown-up building. And so this was in Hosni Mubarak territory?
Yeah, this is the National Democratic Party, Mubarak's political party. This is right next to the Cairo Museum, the famous museum where all of the Tutankhamun material is held. And this is one of the most evident signs of that early revolutionary push in February of last year, where there was a fair amount of infrastructural damage. It's the most evident. And then the second picture is really the average Egyptian, this is in Cairo, a sort of a street worker, who is fairly uneducated, poor, illiterate for the most part. These are the people that have the most to lose, but also the most to gain by fundamental changes in society. And in conversations with people like this, what they're saying is that nothing much has changed. Even on the streets with garbage, they really haven't gotten a handle on basic social welfare structures. And so for most people in Egypt, the revolution really hasn't changed that much. You've just changed Mubarak for the military. And we're not seeing the benefits of that bottom-up change.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, that, and through no fault of our own, but Westerners do have this romanticized version of what, we have an uprising. Well, yes, now automatically democracy will happen there. All of these things as it relates to us here in this place, how does that affect us? What does that mean for us?
It affects us because we trade and interact with all of these societies. We have this global view that argues Western or American style capitalism, democracy, and all the things that go with it are the best paths for these societies. And we've seen in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, where we've been engaged militarily, that we don't always get the outcomes that we think we should get, given that we believe our particular way of life, our particular ideology is the best. It may well be for us, but it may not work in the same way in Egypt or Afghanistan or Iran or Jordan, which is why we need to understand these peoples and places in more depth.
Well, and part of your travel with the Geographical Society, this educational travel, was to identify some of the most pressing problems. You pointed to some, in particular, the Arab Spring made a lot of new problems. It may have solved some problems, but it also brought out these new problems. For us to look in on that, what are some of the most pressing problems?
Well, I always frame these discussions on these trips in the context of what's known as the 7 revolutions. This is a theme that's been around for a while, but I make this argument that geography matters because of the 7 revolutions. And these are the big 7 things that are changing society: climate variability or climate change, geopolitics, resource management, sort of the movement of people across borders. All of these things are more evident in a globalized environment. And these are the things that I want business people and policymakers particularly to better understand.
And we're going to talk more about the 7 revolutions, the American strategy, the new strategy, as we look at more state-sponsored terrorism, which is what we're hearing more of. And does indeed the United States have to look at a more offensive posture in dealing with some of those things? We're going to talk more with Dr. David Keeling when we return with more of Outlook right after this. Stay with us, won't you? Outlook continues, and we are talking with Dr. David Keeling, who is the head of WKU's Geography and Geology Department, just back from a 3-week, 30,000-mile educational tour with the American Geographical Society. You talked about, before the break, the 7 revolutions and what these mean and how you can put these big global issues into some kind of context by using these as a core. And that's important.
It's important because there are so many issues out there that the general public grapple with, that this approach helps contextualize some of these interlocking or interactive relationships. Climate change impacts geopolitics. Geopolitics impacts how you manage resources. Water resources impact legal structure. So the 7 revolutions is a really nice framework for understanding the big challenges for the 21st century.
And some of those big challenges, let's get right into this, because climate change, I can remember years ago doing interviews where there was debate as to whether that was even a real issue. Really? Global climate change? You are seeing and saw firsthand in that, I've heard people pronounce it Maldives.
It depends on what side of the pond you come from, right? Maldives,
Okay.
Maldives, either way is correct.
But there you're seeing real impact.
Absolutely.
Of
You
climate
have
change.
a society that's stretched over thousands of square miles, most of which the territory is 3 feet above sea level. And there's 400,000 people that are directly impacted by rising sea level. In that place, we saw evidence of sand erosion, of coral bleaching, of all of the localized impacts of these big planetary systems. Whether or not it's directly related to human impacts on the environment is irrelevant. The issue is it's happening. We have to adapt to these changes.
And while you're listening in Bowling Green, Kentucky, or one of the contiguous counties, and you're thinking, why on earth, no pun intended, would that affect me, the fact that in this place, millions of miles away for all intents and purposes, why would that affect me?
Because it has to do with American relationships with these people, our role in the international aid community, political conflict, what happens if these people have to move or they're forcibly relocated, and the fact that climate change isn't just affecting faraway places, it's affecting us right here in Kentucky, in South Central Kentucky, with growing seasons and water resources, the way we manage climate impacts, the distribution of species, plants and animals. Those are real things that we have to adapt to locally as well as globally.
That are happening as we speak.
That are happening as we speak.
You know, I've heard more and more talk about how water will become the new oil. What do they mean by that?
In many countries in the Middle East where water is spectacularly scarce, water is more expensive than oil. And one of the real issues for the Sahara in North Africa, for the Middle East, through the Thar Desert of India that we saw firsthand, in some cases villagers have to walk 5 miles a day just to get a pot of water to bring back to their shack out in the country. And these changing climate regimes are going to impact where precipitation falls, the flow of rivers. The Jordan River, for example, is drying up. That has a huge impact on the shrinking Dead Sea, the impact on the Israelis, the Syrians, the Jordanians in that particular region. The Nile is changing its dynamics, and there's 85 million people in Egypt that rely on the Nile as their primary source of water for drinking, agriculture, and industry.
So we could see maybe one day down the road where we're not fighting over oil, we're fighting over water.
Absolutely. There's a lot of observers that argue that water conflicts, water rights, water management will be far more important in our lifetime than oil prices of $5 or $6 a gallon. It doesn't matter. You can't drink oil. You need water for life.
You know, in our lifetime, if you want to use that term, we have learned these terms, cyber warfare, we've learned the term terrorism, but we're redefining what terrorism is, and as a country, as the United States, in how we have to combat and or fight terrorism. It appears now that since we have defeated al-Qaeda for all intents and purposes, that we are now looking at state-sponsored terrorism, which is a very different way of looking at terrorism, because it's not these cells. How do we combat that?
This is a real challenge because the United States and the West particularly has found it really difficult to transition from a bipolar hegemonic world during the Cold War to a world where you have multiple state actors that pursue different types of policies. So our struggles with Iran or with North Korea are just one of many similar types of challenges to understand how states are going to react in this multipolar system. Al-Qaeda is not defeated by any stretch of the imagination. What has happened is that it has gone into different modes. Al-Qaeda and its variations are active in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in various areas. It's a different enemy, but it's the same general problem. It's the issue of resources and human rights and social justice for the majority of those regions' peoples who are disenfranchised and impoverished, which is why the Arab Spring happened.
So, same moniker, al-Qaeda, or they bear a different name?
They're all different names. If you're in the Northwest Territories of Pakistan, they have a different name. If you're in South Sudan, they have a different name. They all have a similar aim. It's ideological, part of it is religious-based, part of it is power-based. there are just different actors that are trying to push back against a global system that is in many ways trying to enforce a particular set of economic or political ideologies that don't fit with the local needs.
Well, all the more reason why geopolitics is so important to study.
Critical.
And understanding that they maybe come to the table with different morals, with different values, with different needs.
Absolutely, which is why we need to understand different points of view.
You know, recently completed was the Seoul, the Nuclear Security Summit on nuclear terrorism. I know you said you hadn't done a lot of research on that just yet, but in your opinion, was this a necessary summit? Did it serve any purpose other than President Obama maybe said something off mic that he shouldn't have to the Russian president?
It raises an important question about the role of major states like Pakistan and India, Russia, China, that are nuclear powers, and the desire for nuclear energy to perhaps shift the focus away from traditional fossil fuels. It's a concern that all of these states have because it is getting easier and easier to find the components to build a nuclear weapon. And the great concern is that rogue states or rogue groups will find a way to get access to that material and do something nasty. And so I think it's important that these countries meet frequently, talk often, and find ways to have common ground over how you manage nuclear security.
So the dialogue.
The dialogue is
It's all
critical.
about the
If we
dialogue.
don't talk, we don't understand.
While you're talking, tell our viewers what they can take away from this discussion that we've just had. You know, you've come back from 21 days, 30,000 miles, traveling the globe, and you come back with what message?
I think the message is that we need to understand more in depth these types of relationships and understand that our lives in Bowling Green, South Central Kentucky, are inextricably linked to a wider world. What happens in the Maldives affects us in Bowling Green. What happens in Russia affects us in Bowling Green. And the more we learn, the more we understand about different views of things, the easier it is to come to some accommodation and compromise and reconciliation on many of these vexing issues, the 7 revolutions of the 21st century.
And before we get away, in the break, there was a graphic up. It was talking about the fact that you had been recently appointed to the North American. You're the editor of the Journal of Transport Geography. What does that mean?
This is a journal in the discipline that focuses primarily on the role of infrastructure in shaping societies. And my role as the editor is to receive manuscripts from researchers and validate their research and how well it's written and thumbs up or thumbs down.
Or as he so aptly put it, it just means more work for him. Dr. David Keeling, it's always a pleasure to have you here. Will you be traveling again soon?
Very soon.
Very soon, and you'll come back and share more information
Most certainly
with us.
will.
You know, we talk about this global stage and the importance of understanding and just dialogue and communication. Well, more and more in higher education, study abroad is becoming a real critical point of contact. We're going to talk more about that when Outlook returns right after this. Stay with us, won't you? The program is Outlook. I'm Barbara Deeb, and don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. On the program today, we're talking about the global stage. Earlier in the program, we met with Dr. David Keeling, the head of WKU's Department of Geography and Geology, who was just back from a 30,000-mile trip covering nearly a handful of countries, who really put it in perspective for us how important that global stage is. And even if you're in Bowling Green, Kentucky or the South Central Kentucky region, you still need to think in those global terms because we're all affected. In particular, universities, institutions of higher learning are talking more about the importance of studying abroad, of getting out there and visiting that global stage. To learn more about that, Erin Greunke joins us. She is with WKU. She's an adjunct professor in the very same department, Geography and Geology. In addition, you are the coordinator of the Study Abroad Symposium that is taking place on the campus of Western Kentucky University. Why is it important to talk about or to have educators or students even think about studying abroad?
Sure. Kind of, you know, what we heard Dr. Keeling touch on in the first part of the show, you know, about making connections globally. I think it's important that students consider studying abroad because it helps them to make those connections. When you see things firsthand for yourself in other countries, it helps you to understand more about the way people live in other places, but also I think it helps students realize more about their whatever major or whatever class they might, courses they might be taking abroad, helps them to learn about it firsthand and to see different perspectives.
And I do think for anyone who's not traveled abroad, your first experience with that is you realize, wow, the world is really old. It's been here a whole lot longer than the United States, and people live very differently. And you're right, it's like a magnifying glass on a whole other world.
And I think it helps you to realize that while we're not the only ones, on this planet, and there are many different ways of doing things. And things are not always right or wrong, just different.
That's a very good point. Not always right or wrong, but different. Studying abroad for a university, and Western Kentucky University is not alone in this quest. Mm-hmm. Everyone is trying to stretch those tentacles, if you will. So to study abroad, a student has to fulfill certain obligations. How does that work?
I think students study abroad for different reasons. I know some people like to explore their major further.
Give me a for instance.
Well, for example, I can tell you the first time I studied abroad was when I was an undergraduate here at Western, and all I knew was I wanted to go to Australia, and I really wasn't concerned. Right, it was a country that I was always fascinated with, and I really wasn't so concerned about what class I was taking. So I ended up taking a biology course as a political science major and geography minor in Australia, and I tell you, taking biology in Australia and seeing, the flora and fauna firsthand, it really brought biology to life for me. Getting to swim in the Great Barrier Reef and, just a couple of feet away from, sea turtles and things like that. And it was really an amazing experience. And I think it really helped me to understand that discipline a lot better. But also, as a political science major and geography minor, I was able to make connections, with the biology course that I was taking, and make the connections between, how the government in Australia, is, big on conservation and
mm-hmm. And
how they
impact.
protect their thing, right?
Sure.
Protect their environment and things like that. So it helped me to make connections even with my own major, even though it wasn't a course that was required for me.
Well, so as an adjunct professor, you're in the classroom, but you also help to coordinate a symposium on study abroad. And I suspect you're bringing together those who've been there, done that, and those, just as an informational session?
Right. Well, the goal kind of is to give students and faculty a forum to discuss study abroad. Originally, when we did this 2 years ago, it was just an internal symposium, and we wanted students to have a chance to kind of reflect on their experience abroad and to to have a way to express how they felt that it applied to their major, how it affected them. But this year we've made it statewide. So there's going to be 11 institutions of higher education coming to Western's campus, and to just share, in different experiences and in best practices for study abroad.
Let's talk about best practices, because you've got someone who, maybe has never been out of the state of Kentucky, maybe has never been out of the county of Warren, where they're going to university, and suddenly they are thrust into this global environment on their own, a student, but they're not on their own. So give us a little perspective on that.
Well, I think it's funny, every time that I've gone abroad with people, I really enjoy getting to see people traveling abroad for the first time, because you can kind of see light bulbs going off, that, you either have a stereotype in mind and it's either confirmed or totally different from what you might imagine someplace. And I've seen American students, go abroad, and one of the first things they might want to do is go to a McDonald's, and I think that's kind of a cultural experience, to be honest, because, the different McDonald's around the world are different from here. So it is kind of a way to compare something that you're familiar to, and to see how things are different. For example, when I visited China last summer, and we went to a McDonald's, the group that we were with, and they had a 24-hour delivery service. You know, I mean, it's just like, I'd never heard of that. Right.
But
so
there's
it's
that
just,
comfort in
right.
knowing.
So you have something familiar, and then, you know, you're able to kind of, I think that's something that the study abroad experience fosters. It's kind of a safer environment, and you're kind of guided through your experiences, and you have faculty members that are able to say, all right, when we get to this location, be looking for this, and kind of guide students through making the connections.
And that's hugely important. So if someone is interested in finding out more about the study abroad program, they can do so how?
Right. Well, I would definitely start with the study abroad office here, study abroad and global learning office, and talk to Director Tom Millington. I would start there, or, you know, within their own department. Many departments have faculty-led programs, and that is one of my favorite ways to go abroad, because you go with professors that you're familiar with.
And you know, the community at large can get involved through classes?
Yeah, I would say there's different ways for the community at large to get involved. I know when we went to China last year, we had some community members that came along with us, and that was a Western event.
So the bottom line you're saying is get out and explore the global stage.
That's right, absolutely.
There you go. We've been talking with Erin Greunke, who is with WKU's Department of Geography and Geology, about study abroad. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And until next time, I'm Barbara Deeb. Thanks for joining us on Outlook.